Hi everybody and welcome to another lecture video. So in this video I'm going to go over early childhood, which generally speaking we're including from about 2 to 6. Remember there is some overlap here, I'm sorry, 2 to 8. So remember there is some overlap here, especially since a lot of people consider toddlerhood to be from the first birthday to about the third. So a little bit of overlap there on the early end of this early childhood. We can start talking about toddlerhood a little bit. In fact, some people even include toddlerhood to about the fourth birthday. On the opposite end of this life stage, there's a reason why I said 6. Some people consider the transition from early childhood into middle childhood at 6. Most widely regarded is usually about 8 years of age. Generally, the milestone, the reason why there's kind of a cutoff here, is that they generally consider it to be when a child starts elementary school or when they start school kind of in general. So that's why it can be a little bit of disagreement there as far as the ages. And again, remember that's just kind of the way it is for all of these life stages. They're not always very clear cut. You look at different sources, you may see slightly different reasoning behind why they have the cutoffs the way they do. So growth and nutrition in early childhood. Children between the ages of about 2 and 6 tend to grow at about 3 inches in height each year and gain 4 to 5 pounds in weight each year and start to lose some of the baby fat. So what you'll see is that really with newborns and infants, they do tend to have a very high body fat content, especially as compared to, say, adults or even adolescents. In early childhood, that's still present, but it's diminishing a little bit. The overall physical growth, mind you, the trend here is that really in infancy, we're growing at the fastest rate we will ever grow in our entire lives. As we go into early childhood, that growth is slowing a little bit. It's still pretty fast, but it's beginning to slow a little bit. And as we go into middle childhood, we'll see where it really slows down, or even in some cases kind of like plateaus. It's sort of the calm before the storm when we go into middle childhood before adolescence. Now, because of the slowing growth and a couple other factors, including that once we get into early childhood, a child is no longer simply being fed what they're fed, right? Either through breast milk or formula or early baby food, right? They kind of are passive in what they can eat. As we get into early childhood, what happens is kids can play a little bit more active of a role in what they eat, right? Because if mom or dad or whoever is feeding them something, the kid doesn't like it and gets really fussy and nasty about it, then maybe the parents won't feed them that food as much. So because of this, what ends up happening is we start to see a lot of nutritional problems really kind of have their root in early childhood, especially in the earlier part of the stage. And in fact, about 1 in 5 American children between 2 and 5 years of age are categorized as being overweight or obese. Caregivers definitely need to be mindful of the fact that in this early part of a person's life, they're really kind of helping to set the stage for preferences, for taste preferences that a kid's going to have throughout their whole life. Now, this is one of those situations where I feel like everybody kind of knows what they should do, right? We all know we should eat fruit. We all know we should eat vegetables. We know we really shouldn't eat processed foods. We know we really shouldn't be eating high fat or high sugar foods, right? That's just, I think pretty much everybody knows that. So you'd think like, well, why would parents do that to their kids? Well, first off, if parents kind of do it for themselves, they're probably going to do it for their kids too. But then the other part of it is if you're really stressed out as a parent and your kid is just absolutely going off, yelling and screaming and crying and fussy because they're hungry and they don't want to eat their carrots or they don't want to eat the fruit that you gave them, they want tater tots or French fries or Chick-fil-A or something else, then you can kind of see where there's just this tendency to be like, well, fine, I'm just going to give them what they want and they'll shut up. Not a good thing to do, especially since, like I said, that's kind of setting the stage then for that child's taste preferences throughout their life. By providing adequate, sound nutrition and limiting sugary snacks and drinks, caregivers can be assured that the child will not starve and will receive adequate nutrition. This is one of the key things, right? a child can be obese, overweight, even adults can be obese, we can be overweight, and be malnourished. That's kind of a big misconception a lot of people have, right? If a kid's diet mostly consists of tater tots, hot dogs, mac and cheese, they're not getting the full range of nutrients that they need. They'll be obese, they'll be large, or even if they're not, they'll be normal size because they're getting a lot of calories, they're storing a lot of fat, but they're not getting the proper nutrients that they need. And that's really key because we're talking about a stage where we're still doing a lot of growth. And we're setting the stage for future life stages where we're definitely going to be doing a lot of growth. So we need those nutrients in order to make sure that growth happens in a healthy way. Physical development. So by age 6, the brain is at 95% of its adult weight, and the development of myelin or myelination. I mentioned this during the last video. So at birth, we're born with 100 billion, give or take, depending on the source you look at, brain cells, neurons. Throughout our life, the growth in the size of our brain is not dictated by a growth in cells. It's dictated by the structures in the brain, especially the myelination. Kind of call that or look at that as being similar to the development of the brain or maturation of the brain. The myelination is the development of that myelin sheath around the axons of neurons. So that process is continuing, and the growth and overall weight of the brain or the mass of the brain isn't due to an increase in brain cells. It's due to an increase of this myelination and a few other factors. Another concept that I talked about in the last video, synaptic pruning. Remember I said at birth and really in the early part of life, we have these just tons and tons and tons of connections throughout our brain because your brain just makes so many synaptic connections because, it's one of those things where it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. But it leads to us not really having very efficient brains. So throughout infancy and really throughout our life, we go through this process of kind of cleaving off or severing those connections that aren't needed. We call that synaptic pruning. So this is continuing through early childhood, right? We're cutting off connections that we don't really need so that the connections that remain can grow stronger and be more efficient. This is a good thing. It allows to us to start having kind of a blossoming, if you will, of cognitive abilities. Now remember, this process isn't uniform, right? So certain parts of your brain become myelinated before other parts. Generally speaking, this is very, very broad generalization. Kind of starts in the back of your head and works forward. So things like your occipital lobe, parietal lobes at the top, temporal lobes at the side are going to be myelinated before certain parts of your frontal lobe. Certainly before certain parts of your prefrontal cortex, which is the area just kind of behind, if you will, your eyebrows. And this is the most advanced, humanistic, kind of high functioning, executive functioning part of your brain is that prefrontal cortex. That's actually the last part to get myelinated, and that won't fully happen completely until adulthood. There are some big changes in the brain's ability at this stage, right? So things like language, which is mostly left hemisphere generally, increases significantly as far as how mature it becomes, the myelination, the synaptic pruning, and what its abilities are. Spatial skills, which is mostly right hemisphere, continue to improve, and the connection between the hemispheres. So remember, your brain, we have a left hemisphere, we have a right hemisphere, but there's a massive amount of interconnection between them, right? And that's done through this thick band of connective tissue called the corpus callosum. Well, that corpus callosum isn't really fully functional at birth, right? It starts to become strengthened. The connections between these two parts of our brain become more efficient, they become better. So that's beginning to happen or continue to happen as we go through early childhood. Both gross motor skills and fine motor skills are developing. They're continuing to develop. Remember, gross motor skills are those larger muscle groups, so like the ability to walk, the ability to kind of sit yourself up. Fine motor skills involve smaller, more exact, more specific movements. So things like being able to draw, being able to pinch your fingers together, things like that. Sexual development in early childhood. So sexuality begins in childhood as a response to physical states and sensation and cannot be interpreted as similar to that of adults. In fact, I'm kind of hesitant to even talk about it as sexual development. And I'll come back to that here in a second. So it says here, boys and girls are capable of erections and vaginal lubrication, of course, depending if you're a boy or a girl anatomically. They're capable of those actions even before birth. It's worth noting though, right? It's not necessarily sexual in nature. It's more of just a physical response to your surroundings, not necessarily indicative of some kind of sexual motivation or anything like that. So the goal here isn't necessarily that you're doing that to engage in sex. It's to just have a basic physiological response, right? So the goal isn't to reach orgasm. It's just you're having these things. Self-stimulation and curiosity about bodies is a natural part of early childhood. I always kind of like to explain it like this, right? In early childhood, little boys and little girls start to understand the difference between little boys and little girls. They start to explore their bodies, all parts of their bodies, right? Not just the parts that maybe we feel more comfortable with them exploring. As children begin to grow, they do become more open with exploring their genitals. Sometimes they'll even expose themselves to other people. Sometimes they'll even engage in masturbation. But again, this isn't masturbation like what may happen in like adolescence or adulthood, where the goal is sexual in nature or it's indicative of a sex drive and the goal is to achieve orgasm. For young kids, it's just more of a fact of this is part of my body. It feels good, so I'm just doing it. They don't really know any different. Of course, for an onlooker, for an adult to see this, you're kind of horrified, right? You're thinking, oh my God, my kid's going to be a serial killer or something like that because she exposed herself in kindergarten. It's important to give kids the guidance, obviously, and make sure that they understand and they know what they're not supposed to do in public. But also, since they're having this body awareness, now is also a good time to talk to them about inappropriate touch from other adults, from other kids, to kind of get them understanding that there's certain boundaries that need to be set in a very limited way. Of course, we're talking about children, but it is important to start talking about that at that young age. So with Piaget and his theory of cognitive development, when we're in early childhood, we're pretty much firmly within the pre-operational stage. So children are learning to use language and think about the world symbolically, helping to develop the foundations needed for the next stage. My way of explaining what's happening in a pre-operational stage is that basically we transition now from the sensory motor, where a young child is just making sense out of things because of their senses, right? What they can see, taste, hear, smell, touch, to where their brain's a little bit more developed in the pre-operational. So now they're able to make sense out of things on a little bit bigger of a level, but they don't have a lot of knowledge, information. They don't really have the cognitive ability, which we'll talk about some of these different aspects, to really make conclusions and piece things together. So usually in the pre-operational stage, they make sense out of things through fantasy, through make-believe, through pretend. This is the age of the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. This is the age of really fantastical explanations for everyday simple phenomenon, which will make a little bit more sense when I go through some of these terms. A really big part of the pre-operational stage, according to Piaget, is something called egocentrism. So in early childhood, egocentrism refers to the tendency to think that everyone sees things in the same way as the child. There's a different type of egocentrism that we'll talk about in adolescence. It's called adolescent egocentrism. In that case, it's more of what we look at for adults and teens, where it's sort of like lack of interest in seeing how other people view things, right? That you're just kind of self-centered. This form of egocentrism isn't necessarily a preference. It's just that the child has no other ability, right? They understand what they understand. They're beginning to think about what they think about, but they just assume everybody else must think and know the same thing, right? So it's just a lack of ability to kind of take other people's viewpoints as being different. Pre-casual thinking describes the way in which children in this stage use their own existing ideas or views to explain cause and effect relationships. So there's a couple different things here, right? Remember, kids starting to learn how the world works. They just don't really understand stuff too well yet, but they have the ability to learn. So one of the big ones you see is animism, the belief that inanimate objects have lifelike qualities. Usually you see this the most in early childhood with things like, kids interacting with their dolls, their toys, their teddy bears, thinking that they're alive, that they can talk to them, they're interacting with them. Artificialism. This is one you don't hear as often. In my mind, I don't really think it's as common, although some people may disagree with me. It probably depends on the kid. So with artificialism, it's the belief that environmental characteristics can be attributed to human actions or interventions. So this is where you'll hear things like a kid telling their parent, it's too hot outside, make it not hot anymore. Right? Or you go to like the beach, or you go to like a spring or something like that. Like, it's too cold, the water's too cold, change it, mommy. You're like, oh, I can't change the, ocean temperature. I wish I had that power, but I don't. So I can't do that. But you'll see where young kids just don't really understand that yet, right? They think that human element, that, mom, dad, their caregiver controls everything. They must also control the weather, and they must also control ocean temperatures and all kinds of other things. So that's the artificialism. Transductive reasoning. This one is a little confusing. So when a child fails to understand the true cause and effect relationships. So transductive reasoning really refers to the fact that you're applying something you know to something you don't know. So everybody, say in this class or in a similar type of class, if you are going through the first part of the semester and you've done a couple different quizzes and you have exam 1 coming up, and your professor says, hey everybody, exam 1 is set up just like the quizzes. The only difference is that there's going to be more questions and there's going to be a time limit, right? You can use transductive reasoning to be like, well, I don't know what exam 1 is, but he said it's like the quizzes. I know what the quizzes are like, so now I can imagine what the exam's going to be like, right? That's applying transductive reasoning. It's taking knowledge of something you know and applying it to something that you don't know. Very simple way of explaining that, but hopefully that kind of conveys that. What children usually have more than a transductive reasoning, because they don't have a lot of information to go off of, is what's called syncretism. So it's a tendency to think that two events occurring simultaneously had some kind of causal relationship. So basically, they're just able to kind of piece things together, right? If this is happening with this, then this must cause this. I'll put this in another, I'll give you an example here, right? So very common. Kids sometimes believe that trees cause the wind because they can feel the wind. They know when it's windy if they go outside, but they see the trees moving their branches. Those two things happen together, so they're assuming that the trees moving is what's causing the wind, right? Syncretism. They're not really understanding, the wind causes the trees to move. All right, cognitive errors. So another way of saying this is these are kind of like bigger milestones. So most of these start to become, they'll be present in early childhood, but by the end of it, and as we go into middle childhood, as we go into the next stage with Piaget, you'll see where children have kind of mastered these errors, or they understand that they're not correct. So the first one we have is centration. Centration is the act of focusing all attention on one characteristic or dimension of a situation and disregarding others. So oftentimes I kind of relate this to like little kids, or if you like dangle keys in front of them, they're just so focused on that it doesn't matter what's going on around them, right? They're just going to focus on those keys. The difference, though, is that with this, it's not about like senses per se. It's more that kids will just focus on one aspect of anything that you really throw at them. So sometimes what you'll see is kids may just focus on the size of something. A good way of showing this, and I think I'll link videos. I know I have one really good video that talks a little bit about and actually shows examples of a kid where he's sitting in front of a lab worker who has 2 cups in front of her with liquid in it. It's like clear cups, glasses. And it has the same amount of liquids, right? And she asks the kid, like, which of these cups has more? And the kid will sit there and they'll put their hand out between the 2 because they can see the layers of the, and if it's even with their hand, they go, they're equal. And then literally in front of the kid, the lab worker will take a taller glass that's a little narrower and pour one of the cups in it. Well, now the level is up higher, right? Because it's a narrower glass. And then she'll ask the kid, which of these 2 has more liquid in it? This one, or are they the same? And the kid will invariably say the taller glass has more liquid in it because it's taller now. Right? So kind of a weird concept. If you see it a couple of times, it's one of those areas where like a picture is worth 1,000 words. There's tons of videos out there that'll show this. But it makes more sense. Conservation. This is kind of a fun one, right? So conservation is the awareness that altering a substance's appearance does not change its basic properties. It says here, sandwich cut in half. Conservation is fun. So this is a great way to start a fight with kids. If you have 2 kids of the same age that don't really understand this conservation yet, and you make them sandwiches, say you make them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Got my 2 kids right in front of me. I take the one kid's sandwich and I cut it in half. I give it to him or her. The other one I give a whole sandwich to. Willing to bet 99% of the time, the kid that got the whole sandwich is going to start complaining. They're going to say, why did I only get 1 sandwich and he got 2? The other kid didn't get 2, right? They got 1 whole sandwich cut in half. But this is kind of an aspect of that centration, right? The kid's focusing just on numbers. So I got 1, I can see 1, but they have 2 because I can see 2. It doesn't matter the shape of it, the size of it. They don't really understand that part because they don't understand that, you just change the appearance of it. So that's the conservation aspect. Those 2 are kind of closely linked though. Irreversibility is the third one on here. So irreversibility is the young child's difficulty mentally reversing a sequence of events. So basically they don't understand that, most things can be undone, right? If something happens, they don't understand that something can be changed. It can be reversed. It says here, centration, conservation errors, and irreversibility reflect the young child's reliance on visual representations. So that's one of the big things, right? We're still kind of having a little bit of that residue from the sensory motor stage. They're relying more on their senses rather than on their cognitive processes. But as we go through this preoperational stage, you see where that becomes less and less to the point that these errors are easily understood. Preoperational children lack the basic logic and the ability to use previous knowledge to determine the missing piece. We call that transitive interference. So one of the biggest parts of early childhood, and this is according to Piaget, but this is actually one that's got a lot of science behind it, even beyond Piaget. So remember I said children have that egocentrism, right? It's the focus on themselves. And it's not so much like a preference. It's not that they're just self-centered. It's that they have the inability to understand other people's views. Well, what happens is in early childhood, what should happen is that in early childhood, that egocentrism starts to decline. And what takes its place is something called theory of mind. Very important for you to know. So the theory of mind is the understanding that the mind holds people's beliefs, desires, emotions, and intentions. By about 4, children's theory of mind allows them to understand that people think differently, have difference in preferences and opinions and viewpoints, and that sometimes they may mask their true feelings. The awareness of the existence of mind is part of social intelligence and helps develop self-awareness and the ability to anticipate the needs of others. Theory of mind is very important. And when you think about it, if you have friends, if you are in any kind of social setting, whether that's school, work, religious, extracurricular activity, you name it, you have to understand that other people have different views than you. You have to understand that other people have different perspectives than you. Some of us do this better than others. But we also have to understand that, well, maybe something's wrong with somebody and they're not telling me because they don't want to tell me, but, they look really down. You have to have that aspect of sympathy, empathy sometimes, right? And that all is offshoots of this theory of mind as well. Because if you didn't have it, you just say, well, I'm happy, so everybody else must be happy too. Now, this is one thing that's kind of key, right? With people who are on the autism spectrum. So autism is not just one specific disorder. It is what's called a spectrum disorder. So that means, no two people with autism are necessarily going to have the same symptoms. They're not going to look the same, sound the same, act the same. There's certain key elements to autism, which we'll kind of go into later. I'll link to different videos because it is very interesting. But with autism, theory of mind is oftentimes impacted in some way. So children with autism spectrum disorders, generally have difficulty with theory of mind. So that could be taking other people's views into consideration, understanding that they may see things, feel things, understand things a little bit different. Their perspectives may be different. Autism, as a list of disorders, as a spectrum of disorders, is generally, though, characterized by persistent deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts, as well as restrictive behaviors and interests. Because of a variety of factors, in early childhood, this is usually kind of when most people are diagnosed with autism. I say a combination of things. First one is this theory of mind. Another one is that language is a big part of this stage, language development. So both of those are oftentimes impacted in some way, shape, or form by autism. So historically, early childhood has been when those diagnoses have been made. Now, there have been some attempts to create more diagnostic tests earlier than this, even into newborn and infancy. And in fact, they say one of the most pronounced, perhaps early indications is things like avoiding eye contact with newborns with their parents. But generally speaking, early childhood is when we're actually kind of really making those diagnoses. The earlier you make a diagnosis, incidentally, with autism, the better off it is. The earlier that child can get interventions that can help them. So theory of mind continued. While the majority of parents notice that the child's behaviors between 18 and 24 months, oftentimes the diagnosis does come later. So again, right, you may notice a lack of looking at a like eye contact between caregiver and parent. This is still on the autism part, by the way. Sometimes you'll see where there's a delay in like the first words or certain developmental milestones. But generally speaking, it's not to the point that it's troublesome enough that they're really going to get help unless it's really suspected early on. Typical signs of autism include no babbling by about 12 months of age, no gesturing by 12 months, no single words by 16 months, it should be two-word, not two-word, two-word phrases by 24 months, and the loss of any language or skills at any age. So language development should be progressive in childhood. So should gross motor skills, fine motor skills, things like that. There is a form of autism spectrum disorders called childhood disintegrative disorder, where a child will hit all milestones and then all of a sudden just kind of stop and then revert back. But like I said, I'll probably link a separate video because that's its own kind of entity to itself. Is just talking about autism spectrum disorders. I don't really want to do that just in this class or in this lecture right now. You see one early form of testing for autism. It's called the Sally Ann test. It's used to determine whether someone lacks the theory of mind. It includes a story about a ball being moved when one child leaves, with children younger than 4 and those with autism generally answering incorrectly. I'll link another video too, besides the autism one, where it's really interesting with showing theory of mind. It's an older video where they, researchers are talking to a group of kids and they take a box of crayons and they take the crayons out and they put like candles in there. Right. So they ask the kid beforehand, what do you think's in here? And they'll say crayons, and they'll open it up and they'll be like, it's not crayons, it's candles. You played a trick on me. but then they'll pull up like a little teddy bear or something, or they'll ask another kid to come in. They'll say, what do you think he'll think is in these crayon box, right? And instead of them saying, oh, I think the teddy bear, I think this kid who just walked in will think they're crayons, they'll say candles. Because that kid knows they're candles, right? So that's an example of the Sally Ann test. Language development. So from about 2 to 6, a child's vocabulary expands from about 200 words to over 10,000. Think about that for a second, right? In just a few short years, you're going from 200 words to about 10,000. Additionally, at 2, those 200 words that you don't really know really well. And in some cases, it's more receptive. Like you can understand the meanings of words before you actually use them on your own. Same is true of adults who learn foreign languages, right? Generally, you understand written stuff and you understand spoken before you're able to actually communicate with other people in that language. Kids are no different. What explains a lot of this really immense amount of word growth, language growth, is something called fast mapping. So basically, words are easily learned through connections between new words and existing concepts. Let me put this in a way that makes more sense. The more words you know, the easier you are able to connect those words either with the meaning behind it, which helps you better understand things and better learn new words, or the more you start to understand basic kind of grammar, language aspects. So I'll give this an example, right? If you know the word work, and you start understanding that, oh, generally in English, if I put ER behind something like that, it's a person who does it. It's a noun, right? I can change a verb to a noun by putting ER. So I know work, right? That's a verb. It's something you're doing. But now if I also know ER, worker, oh, now I just learned another word. Usually if you're engaging actively in that verb as we speak, we put an ing. So working. So now kids are able, once they start understanding these things, to put these together, put these skills together. So if I learn the word swim, I also know a swimmer is somebody who swims. I also know swimming means you're actively doing it now, right? So you're getting more bang for your buck. You're kind of really able to start expanding these skills pretty tremendously. It's also an aspect of plasticity, right? So the more you're using language skills, the more that part of your brain is growing, then the easier it's going to be for you to learn new things because you're constantly engaging that part of your mind. Children can over-regulate grammar rules, though. So what I just explained to you, like putting that ER behind something, is a general rule, but it isn't always the case. So this is where the over-regulation comes in. So children can over-regulate grammar rules because they intuitively discover a rule, then over-generalize it when they are taught to do something in school. So a good example of this, right? I just talked about work. Put an ER at the end, worker. Swim, swimmer. You can use that for most things, but you can't use it for all things. A cop, if you see a cop on the street, you start to say, well, that's somebody who's doing something. That's a noun, but it's not like, what's the root of that, right? It's kind of weird. It's a little bit odd. ED is a good example of this, right? So kids learn, I put ED at the end of something, then I know that that's something that kind of happened in the past, right? So using the examples that I just gave, worked means I did work in the past. But can I say swimmed? No, or your kids do, right? Even some adults I've heard do that, but it's not proper, right? It's swam. So that's an example of over-regulation, right? So a kid starts learning, oh, ED at the end of like a verb means you did it in the past. So walked, worked, but swimmed doesn't work because it's an exception to the rule. Lev Vygotsky. So talking about language development, great intro, good segue into Lev Vygotsky. Remember with Lev Vygotsky, a big part of how he believed cognitive growth happened was through language. So he really thought that early childhood was just a very critically important time. A little bit of a refresher here. Remember with Lev Vygotsky, a big part of it is this idea of a zone of proximal development. So this is the range of material that a child is ready to learn if proper support and guidance are given. So basically, I'm a young kid. My brain's primed. I have the ability to learn a lot of stuff. I have the ability to learn it, but I don't know it yet. So it takes a more experienced other person to teach me, to show me. And that overlap between what I'm capable of learning, but I don't know yet, and I need somebody to teach me, is the actual zone of proximal development itself. The way in which this happens is through scaffolding, right? So it's a process in which the guide, the more experienced other, the more knowledgeable other person, whether that's a teacher, it's a family member, it's a caregiver, they provide the guidance needed to assist a child in a new skill, right? So if a kid has the ability, they have the mental ability, they're able to move their fingers to tie their shoes, they have that ability, but they don't know how to do it yet. So it takes somebody, a teacher or a parent, to show them how to do that, right? That would be the zone of proximal development. Now, the scaffolding part that comes into it is maybe where first they, show them, and I remember kind of this when I was in, I think whatever it was, kindergarten, pre-K, I don't know, where they had like a little thing that you could practice on. It was like a little model shoe that you could tie before you tied your own shoes. So there may be little steps that they work up to. Maybe it's just tying a knot. Maybe it's just learning how to hold on to your laces, right? And that's the first step we're going to do in scaffolding. And we're going to do little baby steps until we build all the way up to you putting your own shoe on and tying that knot yourself. Now, a big part of Vygotsky, remember, he really believed language was key. That interacting with other people, interacting with our environment, especially through language, was a great way in which our brains then develop. So he didn't believe the brain development really happened first. It was more that it happens in concert with all of this exposure to other people and language. Vygotsky believed that private speech was speech that a child engages in to solve problems or clarify thoughts. So private speech is where a child starts to actually speak out loud, but they're not talking to somebody. They're talking to themselves, but they're doing it out loud. Basically, what Vygotsky believed was that in early childhood, this was kind of the first part because kids are learning language skills. They're learning to communicate. So they're doing it out loud, what are really thoughts in their own head. But as early childhood kind of progresses, that private speech changes from private speech spoken out loud to inner speech, where you're kind of talking to yourself, but in your own head, what some of us would call like our inner monologue, right? And we keep that really through adulthood, where we kind of sit there and we talk to ourselves, or we work through problems or something like that. But we're not saying it out loud, or at least most of us aren't. So early childhood is kind of an interesting part where a kid is also beginning to learn the basics of themselves. Really, this is something that'll become a lot more obvious in middle childhood, but the basics of it are beginning to be present in early childhood. So we'll start with self-concept. Self-concept is the idea of who we are, what we are capable of doing, and how we think and feel. So it's sort of like a basic self-awareness. Now there's something called the looking glass self, right? So it involves looking at how others seem to view us and interpreting this as we make judgments about ourselves. This is really important. And again, this is something that really is more obvious in middle childhood, but kids start to learn in early childhood, how are other people looking at me? If I'm exposing myself in kindergarten, which I said is perfectly normal earlier, but other people are looking shocked, horrified. My parent is yelling at me. I may think I'm not doing anything wrong. I may not understand what I'm doing as being wrong, but oh my God, if I'm more self-aware of myself and I'm noticing that other people are looking at me different, I don't like that. Right? So that is what we're talking about as an element of the self-awareness. And it really is big, especially this looking glass self, at really starting the foundations of social interactions, right? So this will be key, especially as we start going into middle childhood, and we're talking about things like, really starting school, like not kindergarten, not daycare, but actual school. where we're beginning to spend more time away from our families and other important aspects. Self-control also tends to be a little bit more involved, right? So early on in early childhood, not a lot of self-control, but you see by the end of early childhood, still not a whole heck of a lot, but a lot more of an attempt to kind of control some of these things. So it involves both response inhibition and delayed gratification, right? So self-control is understanding that if I'm upset, I'm not going to have a temper tantrum, right? On a very basic level. That there may be other ways of handling that. It may mean that, if I wait, I may be in a better situation than now. In fact, a really famous way of showing this delayed gratification in early childhood, y'all can check out, was something called the marshmallow study, right? Where they took kids and they put marshmallows down in front of them and they told them, you can eat that marshmallow now if you want, but if you wait, I think it was like 10 minutes, right? If you wait 10 minutes and that marshmallow is still there, you're going to get 2 marshmallows. Right, so either you can have 1 now or you can have 2 in 10 minutes. Now, most of those kids, especially early on, just gobble down the marshmallow because they're like, I'm not waiting. I want a marshmallow. It's right in front of me. I can't wait. But when kids start to develop more of that self-control as we go into middle childhood more, you'd see where they're like, well, that's a good deal, right? I just have to wait 10 minutes and I get twice as many marshmallows. That sounds great, right? They have more of that self-control. So psychodynamic and psychosocial theories of early childhood, generally speaking, we're talking about 2 stages here. We're talking about the anal stage and we're talking about the phallic stage. So the anal stage is from about 18 months to 3 years. The libido, and remember with psychoanalysis, libido is more like a motivation or an urge for physical pleasure. And it's usually centered in a certain area early on. So in the anal stage, it's focused on your butt, right? Your anus. One of the big goals here, one of the big kind of focuses is mastering potty training. So this takes up a lot of the kids' attention, a lot of their interest. So parental reactions during potty training may result in a child who stubbornly holds on to feces or who purposefully makes a mess. Freud would kind of look at the anal stage as being if parents were really overly structured and strict and made a child feel kind of shameful for defecating or for not mastering potty training as quickly as they could, that could lead to long-lasting problems later on with different aspects of self-control. The opposite's also true, though, right? So parents who didn't really care that much, maybe weren't as involved with the potty training process, could lead to kids that would have issues later in life with self-control. In this regard, it would be more like being really sloppy, not really having a lot of direction or focus. Parents were overly strict with them, and it would be more like they would be too focused, too strict, sort of like we would call today like OCD. In the phallic stage, children start to develop an attraction to the parent of the opposite sex. For boys, anatomical boys, this is called the Oedipus complex. So Freud believed little boys kind of had a attraction to their mother. Calling it really sexual attraction isn't appropriate, right? It's not sexual attraction so much as it's just the focus of the libido. For anatomical females, for girls, it was called the Electra complex. So the idea here was that they had this attraction to their fathers. When the child recognizes the parent of another sex as being unavailable, the child learns to model behavior after the same sex parent. Keep in mind, Freud, different era. A lot of this isn't mainstream psychology, but we do believe early childhood, which I'll talk about here in a second, is really key in the development of gender identity and understanding basics of gender roles. And that's really kind of what Freud was trying to say. Granted, he said it in a way that was very cringy, but that's what he's trying to say. Chatteroff. So Chatteroff studied under Freud, kind of expanded on some of his beliefs. Chatteroff believed that mothering promotes gender stereotypic behaviors. It's worth noting, though, on here that when we talk about Freud especially, he is viewing this through what is a quote unquote traditional family setting where there is a mother and father both present, right? So beyond the problems with his theory in general, one of the other big problems is, okay, well, how does this explain households that have two parents of the same sex? How does this explain households with single parents? They would argue, or some people have argued, well, it's that if I'm a boy and I'm being raised by a single father, right, I don't have the mother to go through with the Oedipus complex, but I may pick something like a teacher at school who happens to be a female, or a neighbor who happens to be a female, or something like that. Introjection. So this is a big part of the phallic stage. Introjection is the process of learning right from wrong, and occurs as children incorporate values from others into their value set. Freud believed that during the phallic stage, which I don't think I clarified here, the phallic stage, right, the focus was on the anus, on potty training in the anal stage. The phallic stage, the focus is on the genitals. But again, not in a sexual way, right? This kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where kids may expose themselves, they may touch themselves, even masturbate, but it's not necessarily sexual in nature, it's just part of their body exploration. So the importance of play. This is really getting more into the psychosocial aspect of growth. But when we're talking about play, this is something that oftentimes is overlooked, but it actually is really critical in fostering those self-concepts, self-control, social skills, problem solving, intelligence thinking, language skills, you name it, right? During early childhood, there's kind of an explosion of different types of play. So you see 6 types that are listed here. Unoccupied play is really the only one that we don't really see in early childhood, right? This is usually generally more newborns, infants, but you can kind of see it more in the second year of life also, ish, right? So it kind of depends. But unoccupied play is not really even something that you'd probably realize as being play, but it's where a child is basically interacting with their environment in a pleasureful, kind of playful way, and it's based on their senses, right? So this is more of a sensory motor type aspect. So they're seeing stuff, they're smelling stuff, they're touching stuff. As we get a little bit older, we start to have a lot of other different types of plays set up. Up to about 3 or 4 years of play, we see solitary play start to take over. We start seeing this where children may do things on their own, like drawing, doing puzzles. Now, obviously, kids can do this well past, 3. It's just it usually kind of begins to start and becomes more noticeable by about 3 years of age. Generally with solitary, right, this is where a kid is just kind of doing something completely on their own. So not with other friends, brothers, sisters, parents, it's just them doing something on their own. Onlooker play also kind of starts about that time, about 3. This is where a child may watch other kids engage in play. So a lot of times what you'll see with this is like where they may watch kids playing a sport, like playing soccer or playing on a playground or something like that. They may not actively be engaging in it, but they're watching it. So they're kind of learning the basics of it. They're learning how people are interacting with one another. Parallel play is one that usually starts also around that time frame, so about 2 to 3, maybe even 4. With parallel play, which is sometimes called adjacent play, a kid is playing with other kids, but it's more like playing along with other kids, right? So it's not really like they're interacting with one another, right? So this is almost more like solitary play with another kid who's doing solitary play, right? So if I'm a young kid and my mom knows another mom who has a kid the same age, and we just like, oh, we're going to do a play date, right? So we're sitting there on the floor, I'm drawing, he's drawing, we're not talking to one another, we're not interacting with one another, we're just doing our own thing, but we happen to be doing it along with the other kid, right? That would be the parallel play. So you're playing with another kid, but not necessarily along with them, right? You're not interacting with them very much. Associative play. Associative play involves kids actually playing together. Um, but oftentimes what's happening here is that they're associating something else with it. So a good example of this is something like the example I just gave, right? So say there's a play date now. I feel a little bit more comfortable with this other kid. I've seen him a bunch of times. So now we're going to be drawing, but we're actually going to draw together. So the association is, it's not just that we're drawing, but it's also that we're talking to one another. Like, what do you want to draw today? I don't know. What do you want to draw? I like blue. Let's draw something blue. Okay, let's do blue, right? So we're doing something together, like the drawing, but we're also doing something else. We're associating other things with it, like communicating with one another. Cooperative play. So cooperative play is what we kind of think of with actual like kids playing, right? So this is where we're actually doing something, we're playing together, we're interacting with one another. So we're talking together, but we're also doing other things. So think about kids at a playground or something. That usually is about 4 to 5 years of age where you start seeing that come out. Constructive play is something that's not on this list, but you need to know. So constructive play can either be with another person or it can be alone. And that other person can be another kid, it can be an adult. But it's engaging in some kind of recreational, enjoyable activity with a purpose, with a goal. So something like a kid doing a puzzle. Right, they're doing something, they're playing, or maybe they're with somebody else doing a puzzle, but there's a goal in mind, right? We need to finish the puzzle. Playing with Legos. There's a goal in mind here, right? I want to make something. It's important because it does help with problem solving. It also helps with things like exploring creativity, helps with like the creation of artwork type process of the establishment of artistry. The other thing that's not on here, which usually is more prevalent towards the end of early childhood, but definitely when we get into middle childhood, just like the constructive play is usually a little bit more present with middle childhood, is something called competitive play. So competitive play really starts, I'd say, more like middle childhood. It can be a little earlier, but it's usually middle childhood through adulthood, right? And this is where you're actually kind of competing with somebody else, right? So you are playing soccer on a team and you're competing with other kids playing soccer. You are playing video games, can be competitive play. The thing that's important with competitive play is that with competitive play, you're actually learning social rules. You're learning how to communicate, especially if it's like a team sport. So some of the important types of play you need to know. Moving on into Erikson and his stages of psychosocial development. So we have initiative versus guilt. So Erikson viewed the relationships people have as an influence of personality development. And when we talk about middle childhood, we're really in the stage of initiative versus guilt. So he believed this began at about age 3. It builds upon the previous trust and autonomy that happens, right? Really kind of banks on attachment, positive, healthy attachment between child and caregiver. So now we're advancing on this and we're showing more interest, and we're having those interests be more of a desire to take initiative or think of ideas and initiate actions. Parental guidance should help the child move towards the right actions. This is kind of key. So the idea is kids are inquisitive. They're starting to explore their world. They should be encouraged in exploring that world in a safe way. The problem that comes in is that sometimes parents, through a variety of reasons, may make the kid kind of feel that they can't do that, right? So this could be where, say, a kid is doing stuff that are dangerous, right? A parent should intervene there and say, no, don't do that, right? Don't go crossing the road. But if you want to play, you want to run around, we're going to play in the yard. You're directing them to a healthier option, to a safer option. But some parents are really, really, really terrified that their kids may hurt themselves. We call them like helicopter parents. Like they're always hovering around the kid, making the sound of like a helicopter on my chest right now. So what a kid may learn in that is, I can't really do things for myself. I really shouldn't take the initiative to learn new things or explore my world because I may hurt myself. And that can actually lead to higher rates of anxiety later in life. Of course, in some cases too, this may be aspect of some kind of physical limitation. I've certainly known people who had really severe health issues early in childhood, or understandably, the parent may be a lot more protective of them because of their physical limitations. So it's really kind of what we're looking at here. The goal is to find a balance between initiative and guilt, not a free-for-all where the parent allows the child to do anything that they want to do, right? That would be way on the end of extreme of initiative, but also one where the parent isn't constantly hovering over and making them feel that, they can't do anything on their own. So I mentioned I'd kind of come back to gender and gender identity, gender roles. So preschool age children become increasingly interested in finding out the differences between boys and girls, both physically and in terms of acceptable activities. Gender identity is followed sometimes later with gender constancy. So that's where you'll kind of start seeing where kids, once they're kind of more aware of what their gender is, where they may focus more on just doing things that are kind of what we call like gender normative or expected or stereotypical of genders. Children learn at a young age that there are distinct expectations for boys and girls, with most children firmly entrenched in culturally appropriate gender roles by about 4 or 5. It's worth noting that when we're talking about gender, folks, we're not talking about sex. Gender is a cultural construct. Sex is biological. Right? So gender is a social aspect of growth. Sex is a biological aspect. Now, some people kind of argue this. They say it's controversial. It really isn't. Basically, what I'm saying is, do you think that the way that men are expected to behave is the same in the United States as it is in every other country across the world? Probably not, right? There may be some things that are a little bit more expected, but there's going to be some differences. I can tell you, having traveled pretty extensively, I've seen men engage in behaviors in other countries that were quite different than they'd be here, right? So I remember seeing straight men in Morocco holding hands with one another, right? Because in that country, that's just a sign of friendship. In the United States, that would not be considered a sign of friendship. I'm not going to hold my hands with my best friend. Because that's just not what's expected here, right? That's indicative of romantic relationship. And ironically, in Morocco, at least the part of Morocco I was in, it was not very LGBTQ friendly. So it was kind of shocking to be like, they're not too friendly about LGBTQ people, but yet there's a lot of guys walking around holding hands. Seemed kind of weird, right? Gender roles are different in each country. Societies dictate gender roles, not biology. Although sometimes it can be an extension of it. So this is what we're talking about here, right, is the gender itself. So gender stereotyping involving overgeneralization about attitudes, traits, or behavior patterns of women or men. What ends up happening is as little boys and girls start to learn these and they start to identify with them or not identify with them, then they start to kind of focus on that. Because remember, they have that centration, right? So they don't really understand ambiguity. They don't understand, gray. They live in a world of very black and white. Generally speaking, this is also part of the social aspects, right? Oftentimes, gender is dictated on kids too. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's just the way societies work. If I'm a new parent, and I know I'm going to be expecting a boy, I may start painting that boy's room where the crib is with, sports stuff, right? I may start decorating it with like football players and baseball players and my favorite, teams. If it's a girl, I may decorate it with fairies and princesses and stuff and butterflies. Just when you look at colors associated, right? Girls are pink, boys are blue. These are things that kind of early on get set. As the child grows, it's not uncommon to hear things. I still hear it all the time where a little boy, falls, bumps his knee or something like that, has a cut. And a parent, whether it's a father, mother, grandparents, whoever, will say something like, stop crying, boys don't cry. You gotta be tough. But yet, if a girl does it, it's, oh my God, sweetie, it's okay. It'll be okay. Let me make it better. Well, they're learning differences in gender, right? Because they can see, well, why is it I bump my knee and I'm told I need to be tough, but she bumps her knee and she's told everything's fine, I want to make it better. So these are how these gender roles really kind of start to be created and enforced. Generally speaking, kids, whatever gender they start to early identify with, they start to become really concrete with that. So you'll see where after a period of exploration, usually kids start to kind of focus on very gender normative, stereotypical types of behaviors. Learning theorists suggest that gender role socialization is a result of the ways in which others send messages about what is acceptable or desirable behavior for males or females. So there's what we say and then there's how we act. If I see my son playing with a Princess Barbie, I may say, oh, that's fine. Boys can play with whatever they want, right? But the kid's probably not picking up on what I'm saying. They're picking up on how I'm acting. And if how I'm acting is, that's fine, right? They're going to be like, oh, well, I don't think this is fine, right? So that is how these are kind of picked up. And indeed, that's how all social norms are really created, right? We all societies have social norms, social customs. Very few of those are ever passed down literally where they tell you something like, a good example of this is something like waiting in a line at Publix or a grocery store or something like that to check out. Say it's a really busy day. There's a line of people waiting to check out. We generally form one line in the United States, more or less, and we face forward. We face the cashier, right? Nobody sat down and told you this at any point in your childhood. No mom, dad didn't sit down and say, okay, now, if it's really busy at a store, what you need to do is form a single line and you're going to face. It's just something you do from watching other people. And importantly, if you step out of that, right, if you turn around and you face the people who are behind you, or you're way out of the line or you cut the line, you're going to be treated differently. People are going to say something. They're going to act differently towards you. And you're going to know pretty quickly, ooh, I did something wrong. We don't like that feeling. So that is how we learn these, right? Same thing with gender roles. Parenting styles. So this is important. There's 4 types of parenting styles. This kind of is piggybacking off of something we've talked about in the prior lecture, though, with attachment styles. So attachment style is how the child views the caregiver. Basically, if they can trust the caregiver. Parenting styles is really more of how the parent views their role as a parent over the child. So there's really 4 types here. It says 3 types, but there really is 4, and you see them listed here. So we have authoritarian, permissive, authoritative, and then uninvolved. With authoritarian parents, traditionally they are focused more on discipline and rules. They don't really focus as much on caring, nurturing, loving, especially expressions of caring, nurturing, and loving. Permissive parents are kind of the exact opposite, right? So they don't really focus on rules or discipline. They focus more on the caring and nurturing, and the loving and the supporting. Authoritative parents, this is one of those rare parts in psychology or psychosocial studies where we say conclusively you should do something, right? This is the way to be. So the best way to be a parent is to be an authoritative parent. So authoritative parenting involves being appropriately strict, reasonable, and affectionate, and allowing negotiation when appropriate. So it's basically having the rules, having the discipline, enforcing those with the discipline. But it's also being caring, supportive, loving, and showing that, telling them that. It's both. The last one on here is uninvolved parenting. So it reflects parents who are disengaged from their children, making no demands and being non-responsive. So I'm going to switch here real quick and go to the whiteboard. Because the way I like to explain this is kind of different. So I have the 4 styles here, right? I have authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and then uninvolved, which sometimes uninvolved is also called neglectful parenting. The way I like to explain this is through an old saying. So I know when I was a kid, I think this comes from like horse training or something. But I know I used to be told a lot, you either learn through the carrot or you learn through the stick. Right? So basically the idea here is you either learn through the carrot through being rewarded, through achieving something, right? Something good happens, so I'm going to do it more often. Or I learn through the stick, right? I learn the hard way. I learn through being punished. That doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, this isn't literal, right? It's not like I was given a carrot as a reward or like I was beaten with a stick. But I think it's a good analogy. So we have the carrot, we have the stick. In this case, though, what I'm talking about with the carrot is really more like parents that are able to give warmth, love, support, to give a reward, to make a child feel good. Stick is more like the punishment, right? It's rules, discipline. Authoritarian parents do not care about this at all. They are all about the stick, right? So they don't really care about telling a kid how great they are, how wonderful they are, even if they do well. They're all about rules and discipline. And in fact, in an extreme form, an authoritarian parent isn't going to tell a kid they did something good because they may view that as being like spoiling the kid, right? I don't want them to, or in some cases too, it may just be that they feel like it's not warranted, right? Why should I tell my kid good job for getting straight A's in school? That's their job, is to get straight A's. If they don't get straight A's, they get punished. So I'm doing my job well as a parent by punishing them for not getting straight A's, right? That's kind of how they view it. Now, it doesn't mean they're always like that 100% of the time, right? It could always be the kid's birthday or Christmas or something where they may do something good for the kid. It's just not in their wheelhouse, right? This is their wheelhouse. Punishment, discipline. Authoritative parents do both. They give the carrot, they give the stick. So they have rules, they enforce those rules with discipline. But they also give praise, they give warmth, they give support, they have no problem showing love and affection for their kids. This is the gold standard, right? This is what you should do as a parent. And think of it this way, right? Which I'll kind of come back to this a little bit later. We're talking here about how, parents view themselves, but really what's happening is in a child's mind, you're creating how they view authority in general. So this is something that gets kind of passed on to like how you view teachers at school, how you view your boss at work, or how you view other people in positions of authority. So imagine this, if you're working a job, do you want to just be told all the things you're doing wrong and never praised about anything? Probably not, right? Most of us would want like an authoritative. If I'm doing something wrong, tell me I'm doing something wrong so I can learn from it and grow from it. But don't be constantly browbeating me, telling me just all the things I did wrong. Also tell me if I did something good, right? Authoritative parent. Permissive parents do not care at all about the stick. They're all about the carrot. They love the carrot. Carrot is the number one thing, right? I am never going to tell my kid no. I'm not going to discipline my kid because my child is the most precious little angel sent from heaven. The problem here is that kids do need rules and they need discipline. They need love and affection too, but they need both. So what happens is that with these authoritarian parents, if you're constantly told what you're doing wrong and you're constantly being browbeaten and punished, at a certain point you just give up, right? Because why should I even try anymore? I'm just going to get punished. I'm going to get disciplined. Like, usually leads to really poor self-esteem, self-confidence. With the permissive parents, they have the opposite problem, right? If these kids are always being told of how amazing they are, they're never really growing, they're never really learning. So what happens is they have a hugely inflated self-esteem. Usually this leads to kids who are really entitled. And that may be great when mom and dad think you're a little princess or a little angel sent from heaven, but what happens when that kid goes to school and their teacher may not think that? Or when they're working and their boss may not think that, right? Reality starts hitting them pretty big and they don't really have the adaptive skills they need to deal. But kids raised by authoritarian and permissive parents do a lot better than ones raised by uninvolved or neglectful, because these parents don't do either. They don't give the carrot, they don't give the stick. Why? Because most of the time they're not even there. Excuse me. For an uninvolved or neglectful parent, their kids are not a priority. Something else is, right? Either it's their work is more important, socializing is more important, and addiction is more important. So these are oftentimes like drug addicts, alcohol addicts, things like that. So they're more worried about those things. Dating is more important to them, right? Their kids are just kind of like second, third, fourth, fifth down the list. And their kids know it. They understand that they're not important. And that's where the problem comes in. Is that as bad as an authoritarian parent may be to their kid, the kid in a weird way could say, well, they wouldn't do all these things if they didn't love me. And at least they're there, right? These kids can't say that because they know they're not really loved. They know that their parent's not there for them. All right, going back to the PowerPoint. Excuse me, folks. I'm so sorry for that. So there is kind of an opposing view of these learning styles. It's not really opposing so much as it's an expansion on it. So this comes from two researchers named Lemasters and Dufresne. They look closely at the motivations of the parent and suggest that parenting styles are designed to meet parent rather than the child's needs. So they kind of expanded, maybe that's a better way of saying it, expanded a little bit on these parenting styles. But you're going to see where there's some parallels. So instead of being authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and neglectful or uninvolved, we have martyr, pal, police officer or drill sergeant, teacher, counselor, and then athletic coach style of parenting. You'll see on this list basically, some easy parallels, but you'll see like there's no uninvolved or neglectful on this list. Really, we have, two that strongly parallel permissive and authoritarian, and then the other three are sort of like blends of authoritative, just different views. So the first one we have in here is martyr. Martyr is a parent who will do anything for the child and may later be used to gain compliance from the child. So oftentimes what you see is a martyr is somebody who can be authoritative, right? They give punishment, they give discipline, they give praise. But oftentimes what it is a parent who gives so much of themselves that then also later they kind of throw it in the kid's face or the teen's face as being, I did all these things for you. You owe it to me to listen to me. How could you want to go leave and go with your friends? Do you know everything I did for you? Right? So it can tend to be a little bit manipulative. Pal. So pal really strongly is linked to a permissive parent, right? A pal is like the permissive parent who wants to be the child's friend and sets very few limitations. You see this oftentimes, especially as children transition into adolescence, where, it's more like, oh, we're sisters, we're besties, right? It's like, no, you still need to be a parent. Now, maybe 20s, 30s, that can shift a little bit, but you're a parent. You're always going to be the parent. You're not the kid's sister or brother. You're not their best friend. You're their parent. Police officer or drill sergeant. This is really kind of strongly linked to the authoritarian parent. So it is very similar to the authoritarian parent with a primary focus on obedience and may find it difficult to let the children learn and grow on their own. So it's all about discipline, rules, very structured type of parenting. Teacher counselor. These types of parents pay a lot of attention to expert advice on parenting and oftentimes seek to rear the perfect child. So this can be more of an authoritative style. The problem here, though, is oftentimes these parents, can be a little cold and they can be a little indifferent to the unique nature of their kid, right? So I can read a book on parenting and I can learn what works for most kids most of the time. But am I being really receptive to what my child needs? Because something works with 10 out of, 12 kids doesn't mean it's going to work with my kid. So by focusing on the research and focusing on what the experts say and focusing on all these things, I'm kind of neglecting just listening to my kid. So that's one of the pitfalls here. Of course, on the flip side, they probably are learning a lot of good skills and a lot of things that may be beneficial in their parenting style. The last one on here, I think personally is kind of the best one. Maybe it's just because this is where I kind of fit in, right? So we're always going to prefer what we feel comfortable with. It's the athletic coach style of parenting. So these types of parents oftentimes try to help their kids understand what needs to happen in certain situations and provide guidance. Usually early on, right? It's a lot more guidance and structure, but as the kid grows, they allow them to make their own mistakes. They allow them to learn from life and provide that guidance in a less structured way. Family life and parenting styles. So there is a lot of cultural influences here in the United States, generally speaking, broad generalization. African American, Hispanic, and Asian parents generally tend towards more authoritarian types of styles than non-Hispanic whites, who usually gravitate more towards authoritative. That's a broad generalization. Also, generally speaking, working class and people from lower socioeconomic status overall, regardless of race or ethnicity, oftentimes gravitate more towards authoritarian styles than do people who are middle class and above. We think part of the reason for that in particular is that, if you're of lower socioeconomic status, you have more of a working class background. You may just be working more. So it's sort of like you have less time to devote to your kids, but you still need things done. So it's just a very matter of fact, to the point. Like, I'm not going to say you're wasting my time for all the things, that you did well. It's just going to be very structured, obedient based, discipline based. Some of it too may just be lack of information, of knowing anything better. Of course, when it comes to parenting, look over operant conditioning. Your book talks about this a little bit. I'm not going to kind of go over this again, but we have, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. I will say this much, for parenting, positive reinforcement is really the best way to modify behavior, right? So giving the child something, even if it's praise, the more times they do something you want them to do, the behavior you want them to engage in, that's positive reinforcement. Negative punishment oftentimes is a lot of people's go-to. So negative punishment means taking away something desirable that the kid wants as a punishment, right? So if you don't make your bed, I'm going to take away your cell phone. Here's where it becomes problematic. A lot of parents do this with their kids, is that they'll start taking things away the more the kid doesn't do something. The problem is, and just think of it yourself, right? If somebody's saying, well, if you don't do this, I'm gonna take away your phone. I'm gonna take an hour from you being able to watch TV, or I'm gonna do this or that. Right? At a certain point, we just kind of say, well, I don't care. Take it all away. And it's just kind of how people are, right? It's sort of like, oh yeah, you think you got the upper hand? Well, I don't even care about that. And then you're kind of left with this, well, what do I do now? All right. I took everything I can take from the kid. They called my bluff. It has its role, but it's not as good as positive reinforcement. Childhood stress and development. So children in early childhood are starting to understand stress. They are starting to be stressed. And it's worth noting there's really three types of stress here, right? There's positive stress, or what we call eustress. There's tolerable stress, and then we have toxic stress, which toxic stress, another name for it is distress. So positive stress, or eustress, is needed and promotes resilience and arises from brief, mild to moderate stress with buffers from caring adults. I like to say positive stress helps a child grow, helps an adult grow, helps us learn. Positive stress can be something as simple as if you're doing some kind of thing like gymnastics, right? Kids going into gymnastics, that they have the stress of having to go and they have to perform, but they're learning a skill, they're doing something, so it's beneficial to them. Tolerable stress is from adverse experiences that are more intense in nature, but short-lived and able to be overcome. So tolerable stress can be things like, you scrape your knee, you get hurt, you're told that you can't get a toy. Right? So maybe you're at the store, mom and dad takes you to the store, you see a toy you want, I really want that toy, but your parents say, no, you're not getting a toy. So you freak out a little bit, maybe have a temper tantrum, right? It's tolerable stress. You're not going to die from it. It's within your bounds of ability to deal with. You're just trying to manipulate your parents. Toxic stress refers to chronic excessive stress that exceeds a child's ability to cope, especially without supportive caregiving. So toxic stress usually you see is something like abuse, really strong forms of neglect, maybe things like the death of a pet, or of a parent, a caregiver, something that's just so overwhelming that the child really isn't able to do it on their own. Children who experience toxic stress or who live in extremely stressful situations of above normal stress over long periods can suffer long-lasting effects from it. If the brain is exposed to long periods of severe stress, it can develop a low threshold and create future stress hypersensitivity. Huge for things like implications for increased risk of like anxiety disorders later in life, but also important in something called learned helplessness, right? So if a kid learns pretty early on, if they're exposed to a lot of toxic stress, basically what they start to learn is, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm not going to die. The stress is here, is that they just are like, well, I guess this is my new normal, so I just give up. They don't try, right? Kind of goes back a little bit to that initiative versus guilt, right? If I'm not showing initiative and I'm being punished for showing initiative, then I'm just going to give up. I'm not going to have initiative anymore. Well, same for this, but that learned helplessness has a lot of really bad implications later in life, because it's setting the kid up for just being able to accept really bad, intolerable things, including things that they could probably change. When we talk about those really severe forms of stress in early childhood, we oftentimes refer to them as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And in fact, if you read a lot of articles on psychological or sociological aspects of childhood growth, you'll see where they'll mention ACEs quite a bit. All right, folks, that's it. Hopefully this wasn't as long of a video as some of the other ones. Hopefully you learned some good information. As always, I'll link some additional videos and resources to help you out. So keep up the good work, everybody, and I look forward to talking to you next time.